Okay, hi everyone. I'm Harvey from Monitor. Monitor Inclusive Markets is a unit based in Mumbai. We've set up 7 years ago to really exploit the potential of business models to serve the poor. I want to talk about, I guess, a little bit of blueprint to scale, but also I think related to the point that Martin just raised. What does it take to actually get innovation to work in this space, and how is that different from how we see innovation that works at the top of the market in developed contexts? Just by way of introduction, I just want to say this is where we're from. So this is the city of Mumbai. I don't know how many of you have been to Mumbai. Okay, quite a few. So this is Dharavi. Some of you will know is a large slum, the largest in India. Up to 1 million people living in Dharavi. Very vibrant place, but also people living in very desperate conditions. And it was really scenes like this that made us think in 2005 that actually, instead of just doing consulting to the usual corporate clients in top of the market, developed world context, that we also wanted to see how we could serve the rest of the market. We were concerned that India was growing incredibly fast, but the fruits of that growth were very unequally divided. Right? It was growing to the top and not to the best population. So we want to see how business could be harnessed to serve the poor as well as the rich. So that's how we started. Since we started, we've done both research and action. So some of you may have read some of the reports we've published, 2 reports on business models in Africa and India that work, as well as things like blueprint to scale. But also very important, we've done some action initiatives on the ground. So we've kind of turned the consulting model on its head and launched 2 initiatives to try to catalyze specific markets around 2 models that we found very interesting and promising, one in housing and another one in water, which is actually where we cooperate with them. So what is a market-based solution for the poor? I won't spend too much time on this. I'm assuming this is a crowd that probably knows what I'm talking about. But just to give some examples, safe drinking water from kiosks for about 4p to 20 litres. Rural BPO jobs, digital jobs in the rural areas, offering huge income increases for the people who live there. Housing, private sector housing, unsubsidized for households who would otherwise be living in low-income neighborhoods or slums in the big cities. Not the poorest of the poor, but people who are still excluded from the formal markets. And things like electricity in the rural areas that the grid is never going to reach. So some of you may have heard about husk power systems, which I'll talk about a little bit more because I think it illustrates the innovation that we see in the sector. We profiled it in the report, Blueprint to Scale. And when I describe husk, I normally start with this and say, well, actually, this is what it looks like in rural Bihar in the middle of the night. It's completely dark. You have hundreds of millions of people in rural India who don't have power, and the government says are unlikely to get power in the foreseeable future. There's no plan to reach these people with electricity. In reality, actually, it's you probably see little bits of kerosene light in the picture, but that's not cheap and not safe for the people who use it. So pretty dark, anyway. Colour's got a bit wonky. Okay. Special tint for today. So this was Husk's innovation, right? They found a way to take rice husk, which is a readily available waste product in rural Bihar, turn it into gas and get that to power generators and create electricity. Right? So that's the generator there. Great innovation, potential to bring power to all these dark parts of the country. The problem is if you take this and put it into a village that has no electricity grid, it's completely useless. Right? There's no way to take the power from the generator to the household. No way for you to get the money back from the household. Those things don't exist where there's no power. And so what Husk had to do was not just do what they're known for, which is this core technology around gasification and generation, but also work out a way to get it to the customer, so build their own distribution systems, billing systems, collection systems, devise a kind of easy-to-use tariff for people who'd never bought electricity before, so you don't want to use the same tariffs that we would use here. I mean, I can't stand the electricity bill. I don't think I can try that on anyone in Bihar. But also they worked upstream. They had to figure out how to get enough generators. There weren't enough power generators, so they converted their own from diesel-powered ones. Funnily enough, in Bihar, there aren't people who know how to work with electricity because it doesn't exist there. So to train their own people to kind of work the plants and run the systems. So it's an incredible range of innovation and activity that they've got to get right to make the model work. This is what the solution looks like, right? Anything less than this doesn't solve the problem. But this is such a greater range of innovation than a generator in a developed world context would have to take on to be successful. So it just illustrates the challenge that's out there for firms trying to pioneer these new models in the context that we're talking about. So what's the challenge here if this is what the companies look like? What we've noticed is there's certainly a lot more money flowing into impact investing today than there was 10, 15 years ago. There's a lot more excitement about the field. There's a lot more excitement about how you can make money. You can make lots of money and solve the world's toughest problems at the same time. As we reflected on that theme, we thought, actually, that doesn't really fit with our own experience and that of our partners like them. What we saw was this. So on the right-hand side is a summary of the companies that we looked at in Africa from our last survey of business models in Africa. We looked at 439 promising inclusive businesses in 9 sub-Saharan African countries. And we said, right, how many of these are actually viable and scaling? Just over 1 in 10, which is actually quite a poor showing. And of those that were viable and scaling, they were getting net margins of maybe 10–15%. So not quite the rosy picture of huge profits and high growth. And then on the other side, with investors, we'd heard from so many investors that they were really finding it difficult to deploy their capital. Right? It's hard to find investable opportunities in this space. And when you look at announcements about which companies are getting investment in India, it's often the same companies again and again, which is quite troubling. And so in this JP Morgan survey from 2011, the number 2 concern that investors named was a shortage of good opportunities to invest. Interestingly, this year, I don't know if any of you saw the report that came out 2 weeks ago. They did the survey again. And it's the same problem in number 2, and at the top, the top-ranked challenge is now lack of appropriate capital across the risk-return spectrum, which is precisely what I'm going to talk about in a second. So what are the challenges? I mean, because, what's leading to all these numbers? The first is the operating environment is very tough, right? Not only do people have very little income and very volatile income, they also have an environment that's very poorly supplied with infrastructure. They may not demand the things that you want to sell them. The value chains may be missing pieces, like it was in the case of Husk. You need to invent new models, right? You can't just take, as Martin says, the top of the market model, and use it to serve the bottom of the pyramid. You've got to adapt new models, and that takes time, that takes effort, takes money, and it's risky. And then the final thing is you've got to assemble these value chains, and where they don't exist, and no one else is going to come in and fill them for you, you need to build into those gaps in the value chain. And my colleague Marketbased describes it as imagining if Google had to build the internet first before it could operate. Right? That's the skill and challenge that some of these operators are moving into. So when we thought, what are the challenges here? If we think about the journey of this pioneer firm, so we're interested in not just any firm operating in the space, but firms that are genuinely developing new business models that can deliver better outcomes for the poor than they could previously get, right? So who's generating more impact on the poor? We thought, okay, there are these 4 stages, right? And it seems very intuitive to most people who look at this, right? First you get the idea of the technology, the business plan, that's the blueprint for the business. You then spend some time validating it, proving it, and getting to viability. You then have to prepare the market, so in an environment where lots of things, infrastructure, demand may not exist, you have to kind of put those in place. And then you can scale, right? But what's interesting about this is when you listen to what's happening, what people are talking about in the sector, generally people talk about the beginning and the end, right? So there's a lot of talk about ideas, blueprints, technology, cool idea, a lot of excitement about that. And then there's a lot of talk about scale. You know, how can we deploy huge amounts of capital and really take these things to, 10 million, 100 million people? There's not a lot of talk about the bits in between, but actually that's where the hard work really is, right? I mean, it takes a lot of work to get a model right in these very, unforgiving environments. Usually many cycles of trial and error to get it right. And then, if you think about the markets that we operate in, that may be missing infrastructure and demand. It might take a long time to generate those, too. And so we think that's a huge gap in what capital has been deployed to do in this space. When we spoke to investors for this study, we got a very strong steer from them that they really wanted to invest on the right-hand side of this chart. Right? They said, well, we'd like a business to have demonstrated unit break-even. We'd like them to be growing already. We'd like the market to be demanding it so we can believe in the business plan. And so they said, towards the right-hand side. And when we look at where funds themselves say they're playing, this matches up. So in this survey of funds operating across India and Africa, most of the funds were to the right-hand side. Very few at the seed or early stage of enterprises. Oh, sorry. Okay, right. So I'm going to finish up. So basically, that creates a pioneer gap in funding and support. And our thesis in Blueprint to Scale is that actually, if you don't fill this gap, you're not going to build the models, and therefore there'll be nothing to invest in. Well, not nothing to invest in, but you won't find the new models to invest in that will really create these huge new impacts that we're looking for. So I'll stop there.